The prosecution is set to finish closing arguments this morning, and then the jury is expected to begin deliberations later today in the trial that has been a blockbuster from the start. The closing arguments produce some of the biggest fireworks to date. Take a listen.
Being a parent is about sacrifice. Sacrificing your time, sacrificing your dreams, and sacrificing your life. There's nothing wrong with young people drinking and dancing and having fun, but that's not the life that Casey has, because Casey is a mom. So she has a choice: a life tethered to a child, or a life free to be 22. Casey Anthony decided on June 16th that something had to be sacrificed. She chose to sacrifice her child.
Speculation upon speculation, guess upon guess. They want you to fill in the gaps with your anger and your emotion. If you hate her, if you think she's a lying, no good slut, then you'll start to look at this evidence in a different light. We all know Casey acted inappropriately and made some mistakes and bad decisions. Casey was a good mother. This child was loved and well taken care of. Why are these allegations being made? It's to make up for the lack of evidence, to have you guessing. The law says you must base your verdict on the evidence, not on emotion.
Let's bring in the rest of our legal team in Orlando. Nancy Grace, the host of Nancy Grace on HLN, and of course here in the studio, GMA legal analyst Dan ABRAMS. And Dan, I'd like to start with you, if I may. The day started with a crushing ruling by the judge saying the defense could not even mention their theory that George Anthony, Casey's father, sexually abused her, and that's what led to her inappropriate behavior after Kaylee went missing.
Well, first of all, I think it was the right ruling, meaning the defense had presented no evidence up to that point that had happened. And when you don't present any evidence, you can't bring it in the closing arguments. But secondly, I think it actually may have helped the defense. The more they argue about George Anthony, the more they point at her father, the weaker their case gets. So I think the fact that they weren't able to go off on what I view as a tangent actually may have helped the defense's case.
Nancy, I was struck listening to Jose Baez's harsh language in his closing yesterday. He repeatedly called Casey Anthony a liar and a, quote, slut, language I found pretty harsh. How do you think it went over with the jury?
Well, I don't think it went over very well at all. Of course, being a liar and a slut is pretty much legal in every jurisdiction in this country. But when you're trying someone for murder one, it's not good to point out your client's bad points. I also noticed that the entire day, the defense had Tot Mom Casey Anthony barricaded from the jury by posters and visual aids. They couldn't see anything she was doing. That was intentional. And you mentioned this ruling by the judge is crushing. I don't see it crushing at all, Elizabeth. It's founded in the law. You can't argue some zany theory to a jury that was not supported by the facts. And Dan's spin on it to try to put a good face on it for the defense that it's good for them, that a major prong of their case was ruled out in closing statements, is crazy. Yeah. They were relying on that. Her alleged sexual molestation by father and brother, which is astronomically improbable.
Right. So Nancy, wait.
To explain her behavior for 31 days.
But if you think it's improbable,
but if, wait, Nancy,
hang on one second. If you think it's improbable, as you just laid it out, then why would it help the defense to argue it? You just said it's so improbable.
Because
I agree with you, it's improbable.
Already committed to it, and that's the only excuse they've got for her not reporting her daughter missing. And another thing that they put up, it's crazy. They put a picture of Tot Mom at age 14 or 15, which the judge immediately made them cover up with tape, surrounded by all her imaginary friends. Dan, my 3-year-olds have imaginary friends. One is named Samuel Pocket, and he lives in a treehouse with the Joker off Batman. But a grown woman doesn't have imaginary friends. What that means, translation, lies to cover up murder.
Nancy, this was obviously the defense's way of trying to explain that 31 days, as you said. The prosecution went at that time period as well, saying that Casey had, quote, sacrificed her daughter so that she could party. To paraphrase one Orlando defense lawyer, while Casey was missing, her mother was out, quote, boozing, stealing, partying, and tattooing.
Well, I got to tell you something, Elizabeth, and I know that you know how I feel. This morning when I came here, I looked at Lucy and John David still asleep, and I thought about Kelly Anthony. And not one time in the defense closing statement did they mourn her death. And I find that to be the most offensive part of their closing argument at all. Another thing they did a 180 on is the whole Roy Cronk utility meter reader, that he stole the body and then redistributed it. They totally backed off of that, and in closing statements, Elizabeth, admit that he left the body there, that none of that ever happened.
I think the biggest problem for the defense was that I think Jose Baez was very condescending.
That they're lying?
Towards the jurors. I think that he was really condescending. He kept telling them about how they shouldn't be fooled, they shouldn't be duped, they shouldn't
Don't let your emotion
right. I mean, it was very
your judgment.
Yeah, I mean, it was very condescending to keep telling them how they're going to get snookered by the prosecution. It didn't show any level of respect for the jurors.
Did he make any points when he repeatedly said the prosecution has not given you any evidence about where Kaylee died, how Kaylee died, or when Kaylee died?
Well, look, here's where I think that they did a good job of shifting gears, is that I think that instead of focusing on as many answers, they posed more questions, meaning they've recognized now that the best argument they have is reasonable doubt as to the cause of death. And instead of saying, we know exactly how she died. Hang on one sec, Nancy.
Like
Hang on one sec.
Instead, Hold
on, Nancy, wait one second.
Instead of focusing on this sort of, these more long shot type arguments and definitive answers as to exactly how she died in the pool, they're saying, we don't know how Kaylee died, which I think is a very good move on their part. I don't know that it's going to work.
And 10 seconds, Nancy?
Well, bottom line, I think the state will argue that you don't give the defendant a gold star or an A+ because she managed to hide the body till it decomposed to a point where you can't tell cause of death. I expect to hear that in the final closing arguments right behind me in about 1 hour.
All right. Nancy Grace, Dan Abrams, thank you so much. We'll be tuning in more as the jury begins its deliberations today.